affluent readers of such verse, and its more serious tone brought it more than usual critical acclaim. 1913's gift book Princess Badoura was a return to more expected material. Although this story was extracted from the Arabian Nights, it gave him the opportunity to explore the art of the Far East, as the princess and other characters were of Chinese origin. His incorporation of this more mild stylistic influence was yet another clear demonstration of his creative imagination and versatility. And when Sent by the Sailor and Other Stories was published in 1914, there were clear signs that Dulac's style was now some distance from the Northern European approach of Rackham and other contemporaries. He had long been fascinated by the art and culture of the Middle East, and he indulged that interest in the book, with images which largely dispensed with conventional perspective and concentrated more on the purely aesthetic combination of shape and colour. The illustrations made great use of patterns and textures, with a far more saturated palette than previously, and considerably less reliance on pen and ink line work. This was the last publication from his original contract, but Leicester Galleries offered another contract for 3 more years. But the outbreak of war in that year put paid to this plan. Wartime restrictions on the supply of paper and print production seriously impeded the world of publishing. With his income severely reduced, Dulac rapidly became depressed, but he did contribute some illustrations to 2 books published to raise money for the Allied forces. He also published his own volume, the Edmund Dulac Fairy Book, the proceeds of which went to assist the work of the French Red Cross. There was also The Dreamer of Dreams, written by the Queen of Romania and published in 1915, but this book only contains 6 colour images. He also started getting involved in more peripheral work, including some theatrical productions and creating graphically stylized caricatures of well-known figures which were published in a few magazines. When the war ended in 1918, his edition of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Tanglewood Tales was published, and this provided yet more evidence of how his more recent stylized approach had taken over his output, and it featured 14 formally constructed but highly decorative watercolours. The book was successful, but unfortunately would prove to be Dulac's final gift book. In the chastened atmosphere and cultural landscape of the post-war years, these lavish and expensive books were one of many cultural phenomena that disappeared practically overnight. Although the gift book is now extinct, Dulac continued to illustrate more modest volumes. 1920 saw the publication of Leonard Rosenthal's book The Kingdom of the Pearl, but although Dulac's illustrations were every bit as engaging as his earlier books, now there were only a handful. Following his separation from his second wife, he also created images for a couple of novels by his lover Helen Beauclerk. The Green Lacquer Pavilion in 1926 and The Love of the Foolish Angel 3 years later were both illustrated with woodcuts in an overtly Art Deco style. He used the same technique for the spot illustrations in his 1927 edition of Treasure Island, and although the colour pages were the expected watercolour renders, in this publication virtually all were distant aerial views where the figures were almost incidental. In 1935, Country Life published Gods and Mortals in Love, with 9 colour images which had first appeared serially in the magazine. It was a remarkably attractive collection, but once again largely dispensed with naturalism. Still unable to generate enough bookwork to keep him gainfully occupied, in the 1930s he began working as a designer of commemorative postage stamps. The book The Daughter of the Stars was published in 1939, but due to constraints applied during the Second World War, it featured just 2 colour images. Other than the design of some wartime currency, his output was practically non-existent, and it wasn't until the later 1940s that he returned to the illustration of books. In 1950, The Golden Cockerel by Alexander Pushkin was published, and this was a serious return to form. The project was obviously a real labour of love, and in addition to writing a translation of the story in English, he created a series of beautiful Russian folk art influenced illustrations and designed the layout of the entire book. The Marriage of Cupid and Psyche was published as a limited edition in 1951, and this series of mild erotic images represented another clear indication of Dulac's persistent creativity and aesthetic judgment in all his creative work. Unfortunately, this would be his last completed project. 2 years later, in 1953, he died of a heart attack at the age of 71 while working on illustrations for John Milton's Masque of Comus. Edmund Dulac was undoubtedly one of the Golden Age's most significant and versatile illustrators, and in a career which spanned half a century, he created some of the most iconic and enduring fantasy images ever seen. His visions of magical faraway places and exotic characters have been a major influence on many later illustrators, and they continue to exert a powerful hold on all our imaginations. It's a widely held opinion that Arthur Rackham was one of the most significant and influential of the Golden Age illustrators, and it's not hard to see why. He was one of the first to take advantage of the transition from wood engraving to photolithographic reproduction of pen and ink drawings, and also one of the earliest to creatively exploit the revolutionary potential of the full-colour print process. But most significantly, Rackham's graphic explorations of the enchanted and sometimes menacing worlds of fairies, goblins, dragons, and just about any other fantasy characters you could think of have become virtual templates for later illustrators to follow. He was born in London in 1867 into a large middle-class family, and as he grew up he spent most of his time drawing and painting. At the age of 18, he took a job as a clerk in the Westminster Fire Office, whilst also studying part-time at Lambeth Art School. Once he'd completed his studies, he went to work for the Westminster Budget newspaper as a reporter and illustrator in 1893. His first unremarkable efforts as a book illustrator were published in the same year in To the Other Side by Thomas Rhodes. And in 1894 he illustrated the Dolly Dialogues by Anthony Hope, which was also competent but fairly run-of-the-mill. In 1896 his ink illustrations for the comically titled book The Zanky Wank and the Blether Witch by S.J. Adair Fitzgerald appeared, and although the drawing still wasn't all it might be, the playful images were manifestly more expressive. It was Maggie Brown's book Two Old Ladies, Two Foolish Fairies and a Tomcat, published in 1897, which was the first real indication that Rackham's work was developing into something more distinctive, and his first real demonstration of his abilities as a watercolourist. The Ingoldsby Legends in 1898 featured mostly monochrome line illustration, but there were a few colour pages too, and the book would be republished a decade later with considerably more colour. An almost exclusively line-illustrated edition of the Tales of the Brothers Grimm was published in 1900, and so was his illustrated Gulliver's Travels. Both books would also be revisited a few years later in full colour. Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving in 1905 was a significant project for Rackham, and it featured more than 50 colour pages. By this point, Rackham had fully refined and consolidated his use of colour to produce remarkably dramatic and atmospheric images. The following year saw the publication of Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens by J.M. Barrie. This book also had around 50 astonishingly well-observed and rendered images which brought fantasy and reality together in a highly absorbing collision of worlds. And it was clear that Rackham was just getting into his stride, because in 1907 his unforgettable illustrated edition of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was published. The surreal and frequently menacing narrative was ideal material for him, and his use of expressive line work combined with a muted and sombre colour palette breathed new life into what John Tenniel had first visualised a half-century earlier. All these consistently compelling narrative images had the power to transfix the reader and hold their attention in a way few others could achieve. Published in 1908, Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream constituted another major creative achievement. The story was yet another ideal project for Rackham, with pixies and fairies in abundance, and a narrative set in an enchanted forest. In 1909, his reworked full-colour version of Gulliver's Travels was published, and it was closely followed by his similarly updated edition of the Tales of the Brothers Grimm. In 1910 and 11, Rackham tackled more serious-minded fantasy material, with interpretations of Richard Wagner's The Rheingold and the Valkyrie and Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods. Being Nordic mythology, there was no room for humour in these tales, and his use of very desaturated colour, combined with the energetic compositions and range of fantasy characters, demonstrated that he was capable of visualising less frivolous, more epic material than his usual subjects. Aesop's Fables in 1912 had some use of colour, but most of the book featured a range of well-imagined and rendered line-only evocations of these ancient stories. A year later, Arthur Rackham's Book of Pictures was published. This was a collection of 44 colour illustrations without text, and it was a clear indication of his status and reputation at the time. This book was created simply to be bought and pored over by those who revered his illustration. His edition of Mother Goose in the same year was primarily a reprint of illustrations which he had originally created to appear sequentially in the American monthly St. Nicholas magazine. He stepped away again from his usual elves and goblins to illustrate A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens in 1915. This was a particularly evocative realisation of the text, and the dark and more sinister moments of this Victorian morality tale left an enduring impression on its readers. The Allies' Fairy Book was Rackham's contribution to the war effort in 1916, and it featured tales from each of the Allied European countries. Profits from this and other books he created were used to fund organisations such as the Red Cross. After the war had ended, many other stylistically similar illustrators were increasingly producing fairy tale and fantasy work, and the market was starting to get rather overcrowded. But even with increased competition, he remained the most highly respected and popular with the public, and he continued to publish yet more work. His illustrated books, English Fairy Tales, The Springtide of Life, and some British ballads were all published in 1918. Cinderella in 1919 and Sleeping Beauty a year later each featured a couple of typical watercolours, but both were almost exclusively illustrated with a series of charming and expressive silhouettes, some of which had included an inventive and attractive use of spot colour. In 1920 he moved out of London and took his family to live in rural West Sussex, and that was also the year that his collaboration with James Stephens on Irish fairy tales was published. By the 1920s, the lavish gift book concept he had greatly benefited from saw a fairly sharp decline, and the number of colour pages in a typical book fell accordingly. Comus by John Milton had first been written in 1634, and in 1921 it provided Rackham with another opportunity to delve into more romantically heroic subject matter. Poor Cecco, if that's how it's pronounced, by Marjorie Williams in 1925, was one of very few contemporary original works of fiction that he illustrated in his career. And this modern-day fantasy produced some appealing results, which again brought fantasy into a recognisable urban world. A year later he returned to Shakespeare for The Tempest, and as with A Midsummer Night's Dream, this was another tale of sorcery and fantasy creatures, this time set on an exotic desert island. And the results were every bit as engrossing as you would expect. In the later 1920s, Rackham turned 60, but he showed little sign of slowing down or preparing to retire, although he was more than wealthy enough to be able to give up work entirely. Both his visualizations of the legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving in 1928 and 1929's The Vicar of Wakefield by Oliver Goldsmith had far fewer illustrations than earlier books, but there was no loss in quality. Between 1932 and 1934, he played to his strengths with 3 fantasies in a row. Fairy Tale by Hans Christian Andersen was followed by Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, and the last of this trio was a version of the Pied Piper of Hamlet, which had been written by Robert Browning. Tales of Mystery and Imagination by Edgar Allan Poe was published in 1935, and it was illustrated almost entirely by a series of typically expressive monochromes, which reflected the dark dramatic tone of the writing. Peer Gynt by Henrik Ibsen was published in 1936, and unfortunately this was the last book he would publish in his lifetime. Arthur Rackham died of cancer at his home in 1939 at the age of 72. A year after his death, his illustrated edition of Kenneth Grahame's Wind in the Willows was published, and although while creating these watercolours he had become increasingly ill and knew his days were numbered, he had managed to complete the book. It was an endearing series of warmly tinted watercolour and ink renders of the English countryside, populated with anthropomorphic woodland creatures, and a fitting full stop to his life and work. The illustration he created more than a century ago still resonates with fantasy art and children's illustration enthusiasts, and I'm glad to say a lot of it is still in print. The list of contemporary illustrators who cite him as a major influence is appropriately long, and despite the fact that the land of his birth can't be bothered to dedicate a museum to the man and his work, it seems certain that Rackham's legacy will endure nevertheless.
God, I don't know if I can even answer it anymore. What is outsider art? Basically, outsider art is... No, I can't start again.
What is outsider art? Oh, you got me. I've been trying to figure that out. I've certainly been called worse things in my life than an outsider artist.
Is that somebody that is working outside, that doesn't mind if it